Welcome to a special edition of Firearms Friday. I'm firearms historian Evan Green, and today Dean, our videographer, and I are at the Wyoming Pioneer Memorial Museum in Douglas, Wyoming. It's about 130 miles north of Cheyenne. It's on the old Oregon Trail. It is adjacent to Fort Fetterman, which was an Army installation during the Indian Wars. So we're really pleased to have this opportunity to look at some new and different firearms for the videos that we're doing through the State Museum. The Pioneer Museum here in Douglas is kind of a sister agency to the Wyoming State Museum. They are under the Department of Parks and Cultural Resources, headquartered in Cheyenne. They have responsibility not only for this museum, but for the Fort Fetterman National Historic Site, and for Camp Douglas, which was a World War II prisoner of war camp that held Italian and German prisoners of war. Again, World War II. So what we have today is kind of a cool little revolver. It was made by Ulinger, and this one is stamped with the name W.L. Grant. And Ulinger was very cautious about putting his own name on these revolvers. He had a 22 caliber version, 22 rimfire, and he had this 32 rimfire, which this one is a 32 caliber. So since about 1857, I think, a guy named Roland White had the patent for a bored-through cylinder, which is really kind of a necessary thing if you're going to load a revolver like this one with a fixed cartridge. So that patent did not expire until about 1870, when Colt made their first, 1872, they made their first cartridge revolver, the 1872 open top, followed in 1873 by the single action Army. So anyway, Ulinger was making these revolvers in violation of that patent. And he made about 10,000, I think, of these. I'll check my notes here in a minute to see that number is correct. But they were actually very well-made, very reliable little revolvers. They saw quite a bit of use in the Civil War. They were pretty much they were never a government issue, but a lot of officers and individual enlisted men purchased them for personal protection on the battlefield. This one's in really nice shape. Belonged to a guy named Ed Stemler. I think that's right. I got to check my notes. These are all new firearms to me, so I need to check my notes. Ulinger. Okay. Were made from 1861 to 1865 by William P. Ulinger of Philadelphia. Most were unmarked except for the serial number, because the revolver was an infringement on that Roland White patent that I mentioned earlier that was held by Smith & Wesson. So again, I was right. He made about 10,000 of these, some in 22 caliber, some in 32 caliber like this one. He was eventually sued by Smith & Wesson. They won the case handily, and the suit put him out of business, out of the firearms business. But again, it's a really attractive little revolver, very reliable, very well made, well finished, nice rosewood grips. So who was Ed Stemler? Interesting guy, Ed Stemler. He came to Wyoming in 1872. He got off the train, made his way to Camp Carlin, which was adjacent to Fort D.A. Russell, or became Fort D.A. Russell, and was hired on as a freighter. He drove ox teams from Cheyenne through Fort Robinson in Nebraska into Montana. It was 152 miles from Cheyenne to Fort Robinson. He carried lumber materials from the Cheyenne area for construction purposes at Fort Robinson. He also freighted from Sydney, another departure point for the Black Hills on the railroad, into the Black Hills area. And we'll look at another revolver that's attributed to him. And the important fact there is that he also freighted supplies, rations, equipment to Native American reservations in South Dakota and Montana. So again, this allegedly is the firearm that he carried when he was running those ox teams. And in those days, you don't see a lot of ox teams on your Western movies and TV programs. But a huge part of the freight that was moved across the continent and transcontinentally and up and down the continent from railheads to points of use were carried by ox teams. They were more docile. They were easier to handle than mule teams or horses. They were less skittish, and they could pull incredible heavy loads. The other thing that you see sometimes in Western movies is these huge Conestoga wagons. Big wagons, huge tall wheels, big canvas top with a sway back. And they're portrayed as settlers or travelers going from the east to the west as using those wagons. Well, most of them didn't. Most of them used a much smaller wagon, again with a canvas top. Those huge Conestoga wagons were freight wagons pulled by ox teams. So Ed Stemler was, they called them bullwhackers because they managed the ox teams pulling those freight wagons. So in the 1870s, he carried supplies, as I said, supplies and rations to reservations throughout the region. And when I was doing my research for this, I ran across an ox yoke. It's a wooden yoke that went over the back of the oxen so that they could be hitched to the wagon and pull the freight wagon. We have an ox bow or ox yoke that was attributed to Ed Stemler in our collection in Cheyenne. And this revolver, and another one we'll talk about shortly, was also attributed to Mr. Stemler. So 1870s, he's a freighter. By the 1880s, he has started a horse and cattle ranch at LaGrange, Wyoming. Prior to that, in 1873, he worked as a cowboy for the Union Cattle Company. And the Union Cattle Company was owned by Thomas and William Sturgis. They were some of the early eastern New York investors who took advantage of the cattle boom, free grass and free water on the plains of Wyoming. The Sturgis brothers were involved in the first electric company in Cheyenne. They founded one of the banks here. They had interests in mining, and they lost a lot of cattle. And basically, William was put out of business by the terrible winter of 1886-87. I have a letter that was written by him in the 1930s that said he lost 70,000 head of cattle in the great die-up of that winter. So again, one of my resources is newspapers.com, where you can search by area and name. And I found that in the 1880s, again, he started that ranch at LaGrange. He was also involved in activities on the panhandle of Nebraska. One of the articles said in 1888 he sold 40 head of horses to outside dealers. And in 1916 he purchased a new Ford from McCleary Stockwell and Company in Nebraska. So here's a guy who came out here on the train at 19 years of age, ran freight wagons, bullwhacking oxen, and bought a brand new Ford in 1916. In 1928, he sold the Stemler Ranch at LaGrange and died of a heart attack in LaGrange in 1933. So that was Ed Stemler, and this is a Ulinger pocket revolver, allegedly carried by Ed when he was doing his freight runs from Cheyenne or Sidney, Nebraska into the Black Hills and Montana. So cool little pistol, and again, very well made. Was one of the major competitors of the equivalent Smith & Wesson, which might have been a Model 2 by that point, when they started making a revolver chambered for the .32 caliber rimfire. So, neat gun. And again, I want to publicly express my appreciation for the Wyoming Pioneer Memorial Museum for having Dean and I come up and visit and do some videos on their firearms. So if you got questions about this particular gun, you should probably contact the museum in Douglas. If you got questions for me or want to talk about firearms in Wyoming history, you can contact me through the Wyoming State Museum. Whoever answers the phone will take a message and I will get back to you. So, thanks for watching.